Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the new strong and weak champs for patch 8.13. I am going to try a bit of a different format for this video. It's not that big of a change, but basically, instead of just going over all the changes in random order, I'm going to have the stronger champions, or the champions that are getting stronger for next patch, at the start of the video, and the weaker champions near the end of the video. So to start it off here, we've got a buff to Gragas. His W's cooldown is getting lowered from 8 seconds at rank 1 all the way down to 5 seconds. Now this could potentially influence top lane Gragas, and it's also going to obviously influence jungle Gragas, but if you think about like top lane Gragas here with his cooldown on his W only being 5 seconds, that could add for a lot of trading potential in the laning phase, and considering your W does give you resist as well, and it also does damage, it's overall a pretty strong ability, so having this on a shorter cooldown now is going to help his jungle clear out. It's also going to help his laning abilities, so I think that overall this change is actually pretty big for Gragas for next patch. So another jungler who's kind of down in the dumps right now, Jarvan, is also getting buffed for next patch. His E's cooldown is getting lowered from 13 at rank 1 down to 11 at all ranks, and then his E's damage is being increased by 20 at rank 1 there, so I don't think these changes are going to make Jarvan that great of a jungler for next patch, because in the Scuttle meta, he does struggle quite a bit against a lot of the meta junglers. If he does not land his EQ combo and he does not hit the knockup, then he's pretty much guaranteed to lose every 2v2 duel in the early game. So even though they are adding damage here and they're buffing the cooldown as well on his E, they're not going to make him like an S tier pick. They're just going to make him a little bit stronger for next patch. So next up here, we have some buffs to Kassadin. Kassadin's W, his E, and his ultimate are all getting a 0.1 AP ratio increase. Now these changes are nice for Kassadin, but because of the meta we're in right now, they're not really going to make him that much better. Kassadin cannot get early priority in lane in almost every single matchup. He does not have very good shove for the first few levels, so it just means that he can't help his jungler out in the early game. He can't really contest Scuttle, and because Scuttle Crab is so important in the meta, and because playing a strong early game champion that can pressure is pretty important, these buffs aren't going to mean too much for Kassadin for next patch. So Kindred is actually getting another buff here in this patch. Her W is getting a new passive to where as she moves and attacks, she's going to gain stacks up to a max of 100, and then once she does reach 100 stacks, her next basic attack is going to deal extra damage. So because she did get buffed in previous patches as well, I think Kindred is actually going to be in a pretty good spot now for 8.13. She might even move up into like tier 1.5, but she's definitely, in my opinion, going to be a tier 2 or an A tier pick in 8.13. So now Pyke is actually getting buffed for next patch. I'm a bit surprised about this one because I think Pyke's actually in a decent spot right now, and as players just get a little bit more time on him, I think he will be in a pretty balanced spot, but they are deciding to buff him for next patch. They're giving him more MR and armor per level. They're buffing his E's 80 ratio along with his ultimate's 80 ratio, and they're giving his ultimate a little bit more damage in the early game. So overall, a lot of different buffs here to Pyke, and I think that with these changes here, this might actually make him an S tier support for 8.13. Some small buffs to Riven here for next patch. Her HP regen is getting increased by 0.3 per level, and then her ultimate's cooldown is getting lowered from 130 down to 120 at rank 1, and then it's going to be the same at rank 3. So a small buff here to Riven's early game and her ability to snowball in the early game. If you do end up getting a kill with your ultimate at level 6, it does mean you're going to have your ultimate off cooldown a little bit earlier, so it's going to allow you to snowball a little bit better in the early game. I don't think these changes mean too much though. Like 10 seconds off your ultimate in the early game isn't gonna mean that much, so I think overall Riven's just gonna stay as strong as she was in previous patches, and she's still gonna be a pretty good pick, but I don't think Riven is S tier or top tier in 8.13. So a few different AD carries are getting buffed in this patch. Jinx is one of them, and she's getting her Q buffed as well as her W buffed, but honestly these changes don't really make Jinx that much better. Her early game is still going to be pretty weak relative to other AD carries and other mages and bruisers being played in the bot lane, and unless you are able to hit like a few Ws in the laning phase, then these W buffs aren't really going to matter too much. So overall Jinx is not really going to get that much better with these changes. So next up here, Twitch is getting a buff for 8.13. His ease AD ratio is getting increased from 0.25 up to 0.35. So a decent buff here to Twitch. If you are going Stormrazor first item, then you are definitely going to feel these changes a lot more than if you went for something like Runin's first item or even Blade of the Ruined King first item. I don't really think these changes are going to matter too much for Twitch just because he's still one of the weaker early game AD carries, and a 0.1 increase on his EAD ratio here is not really going to make him that much better of a pick for next patch. So Tristana is another AD carry getting buffed for 8.13, and considering Tristana right now is sitting at the lowest win rate for any AD carry, these buffs really don't mean too much. These are just basically placebo buffs here. They do make her a little bit better obviously, but they're not going to make her like a B tier or an A tier or an S tier pick for this patch. She's still going to be a weak AD carry. She's a crit AD carry that takes a long time to scale, and that's just not really what you want right now in this meta. Now, Hail of Blades is getting buffed again for 8.13, so 2 patches in a row now this rune is getting buffed. The time between attacks until the effect ends is being increased from 1.5 seconds up to 2 seconds, and then the out of combat cooldown is being lowered from 5 seconds down to 4 seconds. Now, even though these changes are nice here again to Hail of Blades, it is getting buffed for 2 patches in a row. It still does not resolve the issue of the fact that you do actually need to be out of combat in order to make this rune useful. Because you have to be out of combat, it's just not going to be the most consistent rune, and I feel like unless they take that off of the rune, it's just overall going to be a pretty lackluster rune unless they just make the attack speed absolutely absurd on it. So even though these changes are nice here, it's still going to not be the best rune for 8.13. And then another really weird change, and the change that just doesn't really matter here, is to Unsealed Spellbook. The swap cooldown reduction is being increased from 15 seconds up to 20 seconds. I'm pretty sure right now no champion is running Unsealed Spellbook as their #1 best keystone, so with this change here, it's definitely not going to change that, and no champion is going to just start taking this now because of this change. I think that they should just revert Unsealed Spellbook back to how it was before, because I feel like it wasn't even that OP of a rune before. They ended up tweaking it and they ended up putting it into a pretty good state, and then they just reworked it and now nobody takes it, and it's just not a very good rune. So if we take a look at some of the weaker champions now for this patch, Mundo is getting a nerf to his ease damage. The max and minimum damage are both getting lowered. These changes don't really mean too much for Mundo though. He's still going to be a great pick situationally, not the best blind pick in the top lane. He does have a few weaker matchups, and that's not really going to change because of these changes. So Jungle Camille is getting hit with a pretty big nerf for next patch. Her ease damage in the early game is getting nerfed by 15, and then once you get it maxed out, it's getting nerfed by 55 damage. So this is definitely going to hurt Camille's clear in the jungle in the early game. It's also going to hurt her dueling potential a little bit, and because none of the other junglers that are strong in this patch right now are getting nerfed in 8.13, I think these changes could quite possibly move Camille down into tier 2 and out of S tier for 8.13. So Irelia is getting hit with a lot of different nerfs for 8.13. Although a lot of the nerfs here are pretty small nerfs, they definitely do add up because she's getting 6 different nerfs in 8.13. What this means for Irelia in next patch, in my opinion, is that if you're an average Irelia player, if you haven't had a lot of games on her and you can't play her at a very high level, I no longer think she's going to be an S tier pick in this patch. If you do have a lot of games on the champion and if you can play her at a high level, I still think she is going to be a good pick, but on the tier list, she is probably going to fall to S tier for 8.13. So Lucian is getting some small nerfs for this patch. His AD per level is getting lowered by a little bit, and then his ultimate's damage to minions is getting lowered. This does not take away really though from Lucian's dueling potential in the early game and his ability to be one of the strongest early to mid game AD carries right now, so don't really worry too much about these changes. Lucian's still going to be a great pick for next patch. So Master Yi is getting some interesting changes here. His Q's cost is getting lowered, but his Q is no longer going to deal bonus damage to minions. So this is definitely going to hurt Master Yi's clear speed in the early game. And considering Master Yi is not the best jungler right now in the current meta, and because he already doesn't really clear out the jungle super fast, at least compared to some of the meta junglers, I think these changes will actually hurt Master Yi in the early game for next patch, and I do think these changes will make him weaker. So Nunu is getting nerfed for next patch. They're nerfing his W to where the amount of ability power that you give to your teammate and to yourself in the early game is getting lowered from 40% down to 20%. So that's a pretty substantial nerf there. It definitely does hurt the Karthus Nunu combo out in the early game. If you do end up going for full AP Nunu though, and you do end up getting a few AP items, once you reach that point in the game, this would end up being a buff here because they're now adding in like an ability power ratio to his W as well. So overall, this is going to be a nerf to Nunu because for the early game, you are going to be losing out a lot here, especially for the Karthus Nunu combo. But if you are going full AP Nunu, I guess this would end up being a buff if you did reach a certain point in the game. So Singe is getting some nerfs for 8.13, his ease damage is getting lowered by a little bit, and his ultimate's bonus stats that you get from it are being decreased. Now these changes do not affect Singe's ability to get priority in lane, they did not nerf his Q at all, so he's still going to be able to wave clear very quickly, he's still going to get priority in every single lane, and he's still going to be a great top lane pick for 8.13 despite these changes. So Taric is the only support getting nerfed for next patch. He's getting a change to where his ease damage is being lowered and his ultimate's cooldown is getting increased. His ease bonus armor is getting increased from 30% up to 50%, but I think that overall this should end up being a net nerf to Taric. I still think he is going to be a very good support pick though. If you can play the champion well, I think he's one of the most influential supports for solo queue, so he's still going to be a very good pick in my opinion for 8.13. So Vladimir here is getting a decent nerf, but I think that overall it's not going to mean too much for him. His ease AP ratio is getting lowered from 1 down to 0.8. A lot of the time with Vladimir, you are going to overkill with your combo, and I think that because of that, this change doesn't really mean that much for Vladimir. If you can still get ahead on this champion, if you can get your items, you're still going to be a very strong teamfight champion in the mid to late game, and this nerf here really isn't going to change that. So Zoe is getting nerfed for next patch, her W's AP ratio is getting lowered, and her W's move speed duration is also getting lowered. Now I think that if you can play Zoe at a high level and you can hit your E consistently, you can hit your Q consistently, this change doesn't really mean that much. But if you're a Zoe player who cannot consistently land your skill shots, this change is actually going to matter a little bit more because Zoe's W is an ability that's guaranteed damage. So you're losing just guaranteed damage here in next patch here with this nerf. I think this will hurt Zoe players who aren't super proficient on her. And then lastly here, Rageblade is getting nerfed for 8.13, so this is going to be a nerf to Kai'Sa, Varus, Kog'Maw. Those are three of the main Rageblade users down in the bot lane. And then in other roles, Master Yi is a good user in the jungle, and then in the top lane, Aatrox is one right now that is doing very well with it. So overall, it is going to be a nerf to quite a few different champions for 8.13. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. If you did enjoy, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you have yet to already. So thanks for watching, guys. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.